Rude billionaire returns and saw his black pregnant maid crying in the kitchen, then noticed blood all over her. "You're bleeding everywhere and ruining my marble floors." Jonathan Pierce's cruel words died in his throat as he watched his pregnant, black maid Amara collapse in his Hamptons kitchen, her uniform soaked in blood, and suddenly the billionaire who'd never cared about anyone realized he was about to lose the woman he didn't even know he loved. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. The October wind whipped across the manicured lawns of the Pierce estate in East Hampton, New York, as Jonathan Pierce's black Bentley roared up the circular driveway 3 days earlier than expected. At 34, Jonathan was worth $4.2 billion, controlled a tech empire that spanned from Silicon Valley to Manhattan, and had earned a reputation as the most ruthless CEO on Wall Street. His enemies called him heartless. His employees called him terrifying. His few remaining friends called him unreachable. None of them were wrong. The sprawling estate, 12 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, and grounds that stretched to the Atlantic Ocean, had been his grandfather's legacy and his father's pride. Now it served as Jonathan's fortress, a place where he could retreat from a world that had taught him that everyone wanted something from him, and love was just another transaction waiting to happen. He'd built his fortune by trusting no one and feeling nothing. It had served him well for 15 years, ever since his fiancée had left him at the altar for his business rival, taking half his company's secrets with her. Since then, Jonathan Pierce had one rule: never let anyone close enough to hurt you again. The house staff wasn't expecting him back from his London merger until Thursday. Good. He preferred the solitude, the silence that money could buy. What he didn't expect was to hear the soft sound of humming coming from the kitchen as he entered through the side door, his Italian leather shoes silent on the heated marble floors. Meanwhile, in the estate's professional kitchen with its restaurant-grade appliances and panoramic view of the Long Island Sound, Amara Williams stood at the massive sink, washing crystal glasses with the careful precision of someone who couldn't afford to break anything. At 26, she moved with a grace that seemed to belong in dance studios rather than service, but life had taught her that dreams were luxuries she couldn't afford. The humming was unconscious, a lullaby her grandmother used to sing back in their tiny apartment in Detroit before the evictions, before the foster homes, before she'd learned that survival meant making herself invisible. Now, 6 months pregnant and trying to hide it beneath loose uniforms, Amara had found an odd peace in the rhythm of her work at the Pierce estate. She'd been working here for 8 months, ever since she'd aged out of her last foster situation and needed a job that came with housing. The pay was exceptional, the work demanding but honest, and Mr. Pierce was rarely home. When he was, she made sure to stay out of his way. She'd heard the stories from the other staff, how he'd fired 3 housekeepers in his first year for minor infractions, how he spoke to people like they were disposable, how his own family had stopped visiting because of his cruel tongue. But the estate was peaceful when he wasn't there, and the small apartment above the garage was the first stable home she'd had since childhood. She was saving every penny, planning for the baby she hadn't told anyone about, hoping she could figure out how to raise a child while keeping the only steady job she'd ever had. The baby's father, Marcus, a charming law student she'd met at a coffee shop in Manhattan, had disappeared the moment she'd told him about the pregnancy. "I'm not ready for this," he'd said, as if readiness was something you could schedule like a board meeting. The abandonment had stung, but Amara had survived worse. She would survive this too. As she dried the last glass, a sharp pain shot through her lower back. She'd been having them all week. The doctor at the free clinic had said they were normal, just her body adjusting, but today they felt different. Stronger. More insistent. She pressed her hand to her belly, whispering, Easy, little one. Mama's got work to finish. What she didn't know was that Jonathan Pierce had just walked through the door, and her carefully constructed world of invisibility was about to shatter in the most unexpected way possible. Have you ever had to hide something important to protect your livelihood? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The sound of expensive shoes on marble made her freeze. He wasn't supposed to be back until Thursday. Her heart raced as she quickly smoothed her uniform, praying the loose fabric was still hiding what it needed to hide. She turned toward the doorway just as another pain, this one sharp enough to make her gasp, tore through her abdomen. The pain hit Amara like lightning splitting through her core, and she doubled over, her hands gripping the edge of the granite countertop so hard her knuckles went white. The crystal glass she'd been drying slipped from her fingers, shattering against the Italian tile floor in a sound that seemed to echo through the entire estate. "No, no, no," she whispered, feeling the warmth spreading down her legs, seeing the crimson drops that began to stain her white sneakers. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here. Not now. Not when she finally had somewhere stable to. What the hell was that? Jonathan's voice cut through the kitchen like a blade, sharp with the irritation that had become his default tone with staff. He rounded the corner expecting to see another clumsy employee he'd have to replace, his jaw already set with the cutting words he'd perfected over years of maintaining distance through cruelty. Instead, he found his maid, the quiet one, the one who somehow managed to keep the estate immaculate without ever seeming to exist in the same space as him. Collapsed against his kitchen island, her dark skin ashen, tears streaming down her face and blood. There was so much blood. The words died in his throat. For 15 years, Jonathan Pierce had trained himself not to feel. Business was about logic, profit margins, calculated risks. Emotions were weaknesses that competitors exploited, vulnerabilities that led to betrayal. He'd perfected the art of seeing people as functions rather than humans. Employees were productivity units, business partners were potential threats, and household staff were invisible conveniences. But standing in his pristine kitchen, watching this woman, this person he'd barely acknowledged in 8 months, struggle to stay upright while her body betrayed her in the most fundamental way, something cracked in the armor he'd spent over a decade building. "Ma'am." The word came out softer than anything he'd said in years, and it startled them both. "Are you? What's happening?" Amara's eyes snapped up to meet him, and for the first time since she'd started working at the estate, she really looked at him. Not the intimidating silhouette in expensive suits who barked orders and disappeared for weeks at a time, but the man underneath. His steel-gray eyes were wide with something that looked almost like fear. "I'm sorry," she gasped, trying to straighten up, her training as a servant warring with her body's rebellion. "I'll clean this up. I'll replace the glass. Please don't." Another wave of pain crashed through her, and she cried out, her legs giving way entirely. Jonathan moved without thinking, crossing the kitchen in 3 swift strides to catch her before she hit the floor. His hands, soft from a life of luxury, unused to physical labor, gripped her arms with surprising gentleness. "Don't what?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Up close, he could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around her eyes, the way her uniform hung looser than it should, the careful way she held herself. "Don't fire you. Jesus, woman, you're bleeding. How far along are you?" The question hung between them like a confession. Amara stared at him, her breath coming in short gasps. He knew. Somehow, this man who barely looked at her, who treated his staff like expensive furniture, had noticed what she'd been desperately trying to hide. 6 months, she whispered, the admission torn from her lips by pain and fear. "Please, Mr. Pierce, I know the contract says no personal complications, But I need this job. I need the apartment. I have nowhere else to. Shut up. The command was sharp, but his hands were gentle as he helped her lean against the counter. Just stop talking for a second and let me think. Jonathan's mind raced, but for once, it wasn't calculating profit and loss. It was processing the impossible. His invisible maid was 6 months pregnant, bleeding in his kitchen, and terrified that he was going to throw her out. The woman who had been keeping his life running smoothly, who he'd never bothered to really see, was falling apart right in front of him. And he cared. God help him, he actually cared. We need to get you to a hospital, he said, already reaching for his phone. Long Island Jewish Medical Center is 15 minutes away. I'll call ahead, make sure they... No. The word exploded from Amara with desperate force. No hospitals. I can't afford. My insurance doesn't. Please, Mr. Pierce, it might just be false labor. Sometimes this happens. I'll go lie down and it'll stop and I'll be back to work tomorrow. She tried to take a step toward the staff staircase, but her legs buckled again. This time when Jonathan caught her, he felt the tremor that ran through her entire body, saw the fear in her eyes that went deeper than physical pain. How long have you been hiding this? The question came out rougher than he intended, but not from anger, from something he couldn't name. Since before I started working here. The admission was barely audible. I needed the job. I needed a place to live. I thought I could figure it out. I thought I was strong enough to handle it alone. The words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. Alone. She'd been carrying this, all of it, alone. While he'd been playing the part of the untouchable billionaire, this woman had been fighting a battle for survival that he couldn't even imagine. Blood was still seeping through her uniform, pooling on his perfect floors, and suddenly none of it. Not the marble, not the crystal, not the pristine appearance he maintained, mattered at all. You're not alone, he said, and the words surprised him with their conviction. Not anymore. He swept her up into his arms, ignoring her protests, her attempts to maintain dignity even in crisis. She weighed less than she should, he realized. She'd been starving herself to save money, probably skipping meals to prepare for a baby she'd been planning to raise in secret. Mr. Pierce, please, I can't afford. I said shut up. But his voice was gentle now, almost tender. Money isn't the issue here. Your life is. The baby's life is. As he carried her toward the garage where his Bentley waited, Amara's head fell against his shoulder, and he caught the faint scent of the lavender soap she used. Something cheap and practical, but somehow comforting. Her tears were soaking through his expensive shirt, and he found he didn't care about that either. For the first time in 15 years, Jonathan Pierce was about to put someone else's needs before his own carefully constructed walls. And as he settled her into the passenger seat, her blood staining his leather interior, he realized that the armor he'd built to protect himself might have been the very thing that was slowly killing him. The drive to the hospital would take 15 minutes. Neither of them knew that it would change everything. The silence that followed Dr. Martinez's departure felt like a living thing, thick and suffocating in the pristine guest bedroom that had been hastily converted into a medical sanctuary. Jonathan stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sound, his hands clasped behind his back, every muscle in his body rigid with an emotion he refused to name. Behind him, Amara lay propped against silk pillows, her dark skin still pale from blood loss, her eyes fixed on the 4 drip that connected her to life. The baby monitor beside the bed displayed a steady heartbeat, strong, defiant, alive against all odds. Don't have to you why, Amara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The words scraped against her throat like broken glass. I know you have important things to do. Board meetings. Hostile takeovers. Destroying people's lives. Jonathan's jaw clenched, but he didn't turn around. Don't what? Don't remind you that you're Jonathan Pierce, the man who fired Maria for breaking a wine glass? The same man who had security escort James out for being 10 minutes late. Amara's voice gained strength, fueled by exhaustion and pain and the terrible vulnerability of lying helpless in his house. Don't remind you that I'm just the help? You're not just. He stopped himself, the words dying on his lips. What was she then? What was he supposed to call the woman whose blood he'd washed from his hands an hour ago, whose pain had made him feel something he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed? I'm not what? Amara pushed, despite the way each word seemed to cost her energy she didn't have. Not just the maid you barely acknowledge? Not just another employee who's supposed to be grateful for the privilege of cleaning your house. Jonathan finally turned, and the look in his eyes made Amara's breath catch. Gone was the cold businessman who'd terrorized his staff for years. In his place stood a man who looked lost. You're not just anything, he said quietly. And I don't know what the hell that means. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Amara studied his face, really looked at him for the first time since she'd started working here. Without the armor of his expensive suits and commanding presence, he looked younger, more human. The lines around his eyes spoke of exhaustion, not just cruelty. Why? She asked. Why did you help me? Why didn't you just call 911 and let them handle it? Jonathan moved to the chair beside her bed, but he didn't sit. Instead, he gripped the back of it like an anchor. Because he struggled with words that had no place in his carefully controlled vocabulary. Because you were bleeding and you were scared, and I couldn't just stand there and watch. Since when do you care about scared employees? The question hit like a physical blow. Jonathan's knuckles went white against the chair. Maybe I don't know anymore. Amara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of medication and exhaustion pulling at her consciousness. But there was something else, a warmth she didn't want to acknowledge, a dangerous flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with her medical condition. I need to leave, she said suddenly, her eyes snapping open. As soon as I can walk, I need to find somewhere else to work. This is too complicated. No. The word came out sharper than Jonathan intended. He cleared his throat, forced his voice back to its usual controlled tone. The doctor said you need bed rest for at least a week. You're not going anywhere. You can't keep me here. I can and I will. He finally sat down, leaning forward with an intensity that made Amara's pulse quicken. You nearly died on my kitchen floor. Your baby nearly died. Do you think I'm going to let you walk out of here and risk that happening again? It's not your responsibility. It is now. The declaration surprised them both. Jonathan looked as shocked as Amara felt, as if the words had come from some foreign part of himself he didn't recognize. I don't need your pity, Amara said, but her voice lacked conviction. This isn't a pity. Jonathan ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it for the first time in years. This is. I don't know what this is. But you're staying until the doctor clears you. End of discussion. You can't just order me around like. Like what? Like an employee? Like someone whose life I'm trying to save? His voice rose, matching her stubborn energy. You collapsed in my house, bleeding and alone. Do you have any idea what that looked like? Do you have any idea what it felt like to think that you might? He stopped abruptly, The admission too raw, too revealing. Amara stared at him, seeing something in his expression that made her chest tighten. What it felt like to think I might what? Die, he finished quietly. It felt like everything was going to fall apart if you died. The words settled between them like a confession neither was ready for. Amara's hand moved unconsciously to her belly, where their baby. Because somehow, in the space of a few hours, it had become their baby in her mind, continued its steady rhythm of life. I don't understand you, she whispered. Join the club, Jonathan replied, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. I don't understand myself anymore. They sat in silence as the afternoon light shifted across the sound, both of them trying to process what had changed in the space between crisis and care, between employer and employee, between stranger and something else entirely. Outside, the October wind continued to howl across the estate grounds, but inside the guest bedroom, something fragile and complicated and completely unexpected had taken root. Something that would either save them both or destroy everything they thought they knew about love, trust, and the possibility of second chances. Amara closed her eyes again, but this time it wasn't exhaustion that pulled at her consciousness. It was the dangerous, terrifying realization that maybe, just maybe, she was falling for the man who had saved her life, even though everything she knew about Jonathan Pierce told her it was the worst possible mistake she could make. And in his chair beside her bed, Jonathan Pierce sat wondering how a woman he'd barely noticed for 8 months had become the most important person in his world in the span of a single afternoon, and what the hell he was supposed to do about it. The guest bedroom on the second floor of the Pierce estate had been transformed into a makeshift recovery room. Dr. Patricia Hernandez from Southampton Hospital had left an hour ago, her medical bag lighter and her instructions clear. Complete bed rest for at least a week, no stress, and constant monitoring for any signs of complications. Jonathan stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sound, his reflection ghost-like against the darkening October sky. The ambulance had left, the crisis had passed, but something fundamental had shifted in the carefully ordered world he'd constructed around his heart. You don't have to stay. Amara's voice was barely above a whisper from the king-sized bed where she lay propped against silk pillows that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. The 4-drip Dr. Hernandez had insisted on hung beside the bed, feeding nutrients into her system while her body worked to protect the life growing inside her. Jonathan turned from the window, his usual sharp business attire replaced with rolled-up sleeves and loosened tie, the closest thing to casual he'd allowed himself in years. Where exactly would you go? Your apartment above the garage has 15 steps to reach it. Dr. Hernandez said you can't climb stairs for a week. I could stay in the staff quarters downstairs. Those rooms don't have private bathrooms. His tone was matter-of-fact, but something softer had crept into his voice over the past few hours. You'll stay here. Amara shifted uncomfortably against the pillows, her brown eyes studying his face with an intensity that made him want to retreat to his study. No one had looked at him with genuine curiosity in years. Most people were either afraid of him or trying to get something from him. Why? She asked simply. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Why had he carried her to his car instead of calling an ambulance and leaving? Why had he held her hand in the emergency room while Dr. Hernandez ran tests? Why was he standing in this guest bedroom at 8 o'clock at night instead of reviewing quarterly reports in his study? Because you work for me, he said finally, but they both knew it wasn't the whole truth. I've worked for you for 8 months. You've spoken maybe 20 words to me total. Amara's voice was stronger now, the color returning to her cheeks. Today you held my hand while a stranger examined me and told Dr. Hernandez you'd personally ensure I followed her instructions. That's not normal employer behavior. Jonathan moved to the leather chair beside the bed, maintaining what he thought was a safe distance. But even 6 feet away, he could smell the faint scent of cocoa butter lotion on her skin, could see the way her hand kept moving protectively to her belly. Maybe I don't want a lawsuit if something happens to you on my property. Amara almost smiled at that. Mr. Pierce, I'm a 26-year-old former foster kid with no family and no money. Who exactly would sue you? The casual mention of her background hit him unexpectedly. Foster care. No family. He'd read her employment file when he'd hired her, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that bureaucratic paperwork couldn't. Tell me about the baby's father. The words came out before he could stop them. Amara's hand stilled on her belly. Why? Because someone should know. In case. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that involved something happening to her. In case what? In case I die and you need someone to claim the body. Her voice carried an edge of the toughness that had kept her alive through years in the system. Don't say that. The sharpness in his tone surprised them both. Jonathan rarely showed emotion beyond cold displeasure or calculated charm when it served his business interests. This was something else entirely. Something that sounded almost like fear. Amara studied his face in the lamplight. His name was Marcus, law student at Columbia. When I told him about the pregnancy, he said he wasn't ready to be a father, and I haven't heard from him since. Bastard. Maybe. But at least he was honest. Most men would have made promises they never intended to keep. Jonathan flinched. The comment wasn't directed at him, but it landed like a personal attack. How many promises had he broken over the years? How many people had he discarded when they were no longer useful? Is that what you think? That all men are liars? I think most people say what they need to say to get what they want, present company included. Amara met his eyes directly. You're not staying in this room out of kindness, Mr. Pierce. You're staying because something about today scared you, and you don't like being scared. The accuracy of her observation was like a punch to the gut. Jonathan Pierce, who could negotiate billion-dollar deals without blinking, who had stared down hostile takeovers and emerged victorious, was indeed scared. Terrified, actually. Because for 3 hours today, watching Amara fight for her life and her baby's life, he had felt something he'd thought he'd successfully killed years ago. He had felt like someone's safety mattered more than his own comfort. You're right, he said quietly. I am scared. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither of them was sure they should cross. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, waves crashed against the shore of his private beach. Of what? Amara's voice was gentler now, as if she sensed she was approaching something fragile. Jonathan was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of careful isolation, of caring about someone who could leave. The honesty was raw, unpolished, nothing like the calculated responses he gave in boardrooms and interviews. Amara felt something shift in her chest, not the physical pain that had consumed her hours ago, but an emotional recognition that was somehow more dangerous. I'm not going anywhere, she said softly. I can't afford to. That's not what I mean. I know what you mean. She adjusted the 4-line that tethered her to the medical equipment. But I'm not her, Mr. Pierce. I'm not whoever taught you that caring was dangerous. The fact that she could see through him so easily should have sent him running from the room. Instead, he found himself leaning forward in the chair, closing the distance he'd tried to maintain. How do you do that? Do what? See things I don't say. Amara was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the silk comforter. When you grow up in foster care, you learn to read people quickly. Your survival depends on knowing who's safe and who's dangerous, who means what they say and who's just talking. You get good at seeing what's underneath. And what do you see when you look at me? The question was barely audible, as if he was afraid of the answer. Amara turned her head on the pillow to study his face, really study it. Without the armor of his usual scowl, without the intimidating boardroom posture, Jonathan Pierce looked younger than his 34 years. Tired. Lonely in a way that had nothing to do with being alone. I see someone who's been hurt badly enough to build walls so high he forgot there might be something worth protecting inside them. Jonathan felt his breath catch. When was the last time someone had seen him as anything other than a bank account with legs or a stepping stone to their own ambitions? The baby, he said suddenly, desperate to change the subject before he revealed more than he could handle. Do you know? It's a girl. Amara's hand moved to her belly again, and for the first time since he'd found her in the kitchen, she smiled, a real smile that transformed her entire face. I found out last month. I haven't picked a name yet, but I know she's going to be strong. She'd have to be, considering everything she's already survived. She's lucky to have you as a mother. The words surprised them both with their sincerity. You don't know that. You don't know me at all. I know you've been working 12-hour days while pregnant and never complained once. I know you've been saving money instead of spending it, planning for someone else's future instead of your own immediate comfort. I know you were more worried about losing your job than losing your life today. Jonathan's voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if he was convincing himself as much as her. That tells me everything I need to know about what kind of mother you'll be. Amara felt tears prick her eyes, the first tears she'd allowed herself since the crisis had passed. Thank you. For what? For seeing me as more than just the help. The simple statement hit Jonathan like a physical blow. How many people had he reduced to their function in his life instead of seeing them as whole human beings with hopes and fears and dreams? Before he could respond, Amara winced as another small contraction rippled through her abdomen. Nothing like the crisis from earlier, but enough to remind them both how fragile everything still was. I should let you rest, Jonathan said, starting to rise from the chair. Wait. Amara's voice stopped him. Would you mind staying a little longer? Just until I fall asleep. I know it sounds silly, but I don't want to be alone right now. Jonathan settled back into the chair, and something in his chest loosened at the trust implicit in her request. It doesn't sound silly. As Amara's breathing gradually deepened and she drifted toward sleep, Jonathan found himself studying her face in the lamplight. The high cheekbones, the long eyelashes, the way her hand never quite left her belly even in unconsciousness. She looked so young, so vulnerable, and yet there was a strength in the set of her jaw that spoke of battles fought and won. For the first time in 15 years, Jonathan Pierce fell asleep in a chair, keeping watch over someone who mattered more than his own comfort. Neither of them knew that this night would be the last peaceful one they'd have for a while, or that forces beyond their control were already setting in motion the events that would either destroy the fragile connection growing between them or forge it into something unbreakable. The silence in Jonathan's private study stretched like a taut wire as Amara sat in the leather chair across from his desk, her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea she hadn't touched. 3 days had passed since the miscarriage scare, 3 days of Jonathan hovering like an overprotective shadow, canceling meetings, postponing trips to London, and driving his assistant crazy with his sudden unavailability. Dr. Sarah Chen had been clear. Complete bed rest for a week, no stress, and careful monitoring. What she hadn't mentioned was how to handle the way Jonathan looked at Amara now, not like an employee, but like something precious that needed protecting. "You should be resting," Jonathan said for the 100th time, though he made no move to send her back to her room. The truth was, he couldn't seem to let her out of his sight. Every time she disappeared, even to the bathroom, he found himself listening for sounds of distress. "I'm tired of lying down," Amara replied, finally meeting his eyes. "Besides, we need to talk about what happens next." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "What happens next is you focus on getting better." "And then what? You go back to treating me like furniture?" "I go back to pretending you don't exist." Her voice carried a weariness that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. "Jonathan, what happened in that kitchen changed something, and we both know it." He stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the sound. The late afternoon light caught the silver threads in his dark hair, and Amara noticed, not for the first time, how lonely he looked even in his own home. "You want to know what changed?" His voice was rough with an emotion he couldn't name. "I spent 15 years building walls, Amara, convincing myself that caring about people was a weakness I couldn't afford. And then I found you bleeding on my kitchen floor, and every single one of those walls crumbled in about 30 seconds. Amara set down her tea, her heart racing. "Jonathan." "No, let me finish." He turned to face her, his dark eyes intense. "You want the truth? Here it is. I haven't been able to work, eat, or sleep properly since that day because all I can think about is what would have happened if I'd come home an hour later. If you'd been alone. If I'd lost." He stopped, his hands clenching into fists. "If you'd lost what?" The question hung in the air between them. Jonathan looked at this woman, this beautiful, strong, impossible woman who'd somehow become the center of his universe in 3 days, and felt the last of his defenses crumble. "If I'd lost you," he whispered. Amara's breath caught. "You barely know me." "Don't I?" He moved closer, his voice gaining strength. "You hum when you think no one's listening. You save every penny but spent your last $20 on flowers for Mrs. Henderson when her husband died. You read to yourself in 3 different languages, but you pretend you're not educated because it makes other people more comfortable. You touch your belly when you think no one's watching, and your face lights up like sunrise." Tears stung Amara's eyes. "How do you?" "Because I've been watching you for months, Amara. Trying to figure out why the hell my house feels empty when you're not in it." His laugh was bitter. "Do you know how terrifying that is for someone like me?" She stood slowly, her legs still shaky but her resolve strong. "Someone like you. Someone who's been abandoned by everyone who was supposed to love him." The words came out raw, unguarded. "My mother left when I was 8. Packed her bags one morning and drove away without a word. My father spent the next 10 years telling me it was because I wasn't worth staying for. That I was too difficult, too demanding, too much trouble." Amara's heart broke for the 8-year-old boy hidden behind the billionaire's armor. "Jonathan." Then there was Victoria. His voice hardened. "I thought I'd found someone who could love me despite all my flaws. We were engaged for 2 years. I gave her everything. Access to my accounts, my business plans, my heart. The morning of our wedding, I got a call from her lawyers. She'd taken half my company's trade secrets to my biggest competitor, along with $50 million in liquid assets I'd put in her name. My God. She left a note," Jonathan continued, his voice hollow with old pain. "Said she couldn't marry someone so cold, so impossible to love. Said she'd tried, but I was broken beyond repair." Amara moved toward him without conscious thought, her hand reaching for his face. "You're not broken." He caught her wrist gently, his thumb tracing over her pulse point. "Aren't I? I've spent 15 years proving Victoria right. I fire people for minor mistakes. I crush competitors without mercy. I've made cruelty my brand because it felt safer than risking my heart again." "But you saved me," Amara whispered. "You held me when I was bleeding and scared. You haven't left my side in 3 days. Because somewhere along the way, you became more important than my fear." His voice broke on the admission. "And that terrifies me more than any hostile takeover or business war ever could." Amara studied his face, the sharp cheekbones, the eyes that had learned to hide so much pain, the mouth that had forgotten how to be gentle until 3 days ago. "You want to know my story, Jonathan? The real one?" He nodded, not trusting his voice. "I was 3 when my parents died in a car accident in Detroit. Drunk driver. I went into the system, and for the next 15 years, I was shuffled between homes where I was either ignored, mistreated, or seen as a monthly check." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. "I learned early that loving people was dangerous because they always left. Foster families, social workers, friends. Everyone was temporary." Jonathan's grip on her wrist tightened protectively. "I put myself through community college working 3 jobs. Then got a scholarship to NYU for literature. But I couldn't afford to finish. Had to drop out when my foster stipend ended. Started working service jobs to survive." She looked down at their joined hands. "I've spent my whole life feeling like I didn't belong anywhere with anyone." "And the baby's father?" Pain flashed across her features. "Marcus. I met him at a Starbucks near campus. He was charming, educated, everything I thought I wanted. For 6 months, I let myself believe someone like him could love someone like me." Her laugh was bitter. "The moment I told him about the pregnancy, he was gone. Blocked my number, changed apartments, disappeared like I'd never existed." "His loss," Jonathan said fiercely. "Is it?" Amara's eyes met his. "Or am I just someone who's too broken, too difficult, too much trouble to love?" The echo of his own words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. Here was this incredible woman, carrying the same wounds, the same fears, the same desperate need to be worthy of love that had driven him to build walls so high he'd forgotten how to climb down. "Amara," he said softly, releasing her wrist to cup her face in his hands. "Look at me." She did, tears threatening to spill over. "We're both terrified," he whispered. "We're both scarred. We've both been abandoned by people who were supposed to protect us. But maybe," his voice caught, "maybe that's exactly why we found each other. Do you believe 2 broken people can heal each other, or do we need to be whole before we can truly love?" Share your thoughts below. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the study, but neither of them moved. They stood there, foreheads nearly touching, breathing the same air, balanced on the knife's edge between devastating honesty and the possibility of something neither had dared hope for. Love. The private medical wing of Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan had never felt so intimate. 3 days had passed since the emergency, and the sterile white room had been transformed into something warmer by Jonathan's quiet determination. Fresh orchids from his estate's greenhouse lined the windowsill, soft jazz played from a hidden speaker system he'd had installed, and the harsh fluorescent lights had been replaced with warmer LED panels that cast everything in a golden glow. Amara sat propped against silk pillows, also Jonathan's doing, watching him pace the length of the room for the 100th time that morning. The man who had once terrified her with his cold efficiency now moved with the restless energy of someone who cared too much. "You're going to wear a hole in that floor," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that made something flutter in his chest. Jonathan stopped mid-stride, turning to face her. The woman in the bed bore little resemblance to the maid who had collapsed in his kitchen. Gone was the careful invisibility, the hunched shoulders, the way she used to make herself small. In its place was a quiet confidence that took his breath away. "The doctor said you need rest. I'm just making sure you get it." Amara laughed, the first real laugh he'd heard from her, and the sound went straight to his soul. Jonathan Pierce, billionaire nursemaid. Who would have thought? The use of his first name should have irritated him. For 15 years, everyone called him Mr. Pierce, sir, or boss. But hearing it in her voice, soft and teasing and completely without fear, made him feel like a man instead of a fortress. "I prefer concerned employer," he said, but there was no edge to it anymore. The walls he'd spent decades building had crumbled so completely he barely recognized himself. "Is that what we're calling it?" Amara's eyes sparkled with mischief, and Jonathan realized he was seeing the woman she'd been before life had taught her to hide. "Because the way you held my hand during the ultrasound yesterday looked like more than employer concern." Heat crept up Jonathan's neck. The ultrasound had been routine, Dr. Martinez checking to ensure the baby was developing normally after the scare. But when the image had appeared on screen, showing a tiny perfect profile, Amara had reached for his hand without thinking, and he'd held on like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to earth. "Your daughter is beautiful," he said quietly, avoiding her gaze. "She is, isn't she?" Amara's hand moved instinctively to her belly, now proudly rounded beneath the soft cotton gown. "I was so scared I was going to lose her. When I woke up and you were there." She trailed off, but Jonathan heard what she didn't say. When she'd opened her eyes in the hospital bed, the first face she'd seen had been his, not the cold, ruthless businessman, but a man with tears in his eyes who looked like he'd aged years in a few hours. "You saved us both," she whispered. Jonathan moved to the chair beside her bed, the same chair he'd barely left since they'd arrived. "You saved yourself, Amara. I couldn't let anything happen to you." The admission hung in the air between them, loaded with everything they hadn't said. For 3 days, they'd danced around the shift in their relationship. The way he touched her forehead to check for fever, the way she smiled when he brought her favorite tea from a shop in Soho, the way they talked until visiting hours ended about everything except what was really happening. "Can I ask you something?" Amara's voice was careful, testing waters she'd never dared enter before. "Anything. Why did you fire Jenny Martinez last year?" "Really?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. Jenny had been a housekeeper who'd worked for his family for a decade before he'd let her go for what he'd called chronic lateness. The truth was more complicated. She kept asking about my personal life, wanting to know if I was eating enough, if I was happy, if I ever called my sister. He ran a hand through his hair, disheveling the perfect styling. "She cared about me, and I couldn't handle it." "You fired her for caring about you?" "I fired her because caring about people is dangerous." The words came out harsher than he intended. "Every time I've let someone in, they've used it against me. My ex-fiancé, business partners, even family members who saw dollar signs instead of relationships." Amara studied his face, seeing past the successful exterior to the wounded man beneath. "So you decided to stop letting people in at all?" "It was easier." Was it? The simple question hit him like a physical blow. Was it easier? 15 years of isolation, of treating people like interchangeable parts in his empire, of going to bed every night in a mansion that felt more like a mausoleum than a home? No, he admitted, the word barely audible. It was hell. Amara reached for his hand, and this time he didn't pull away. Her fingers were warm and strong, calloused from honest work but gentle in a way that made him want to confess every secret he'd ever buried. I understand, she said. After Marcus left, after growing up in foster care where caring about people just meant more pain when they sent you away, I learned to not expect anything from anyone. It was safer. And now, she squeezed his hand, her thumb tracing across his knuckles. Now I'm terrified because I'm starting to care about someone who could break my heart worse than anyone ever has. The confession stopped his breath. Jonathan looked at their joined hands, his pale and soft from a life of privilege, hers darker and work-worn but infinitely more honest, and saw the future he'd never allowed himself to imagine. Amara. I know it's crazy, she rushed on. I know you're Jonathan Pierce and I'm just the maid who got pregnant and caused you all this trouble. I know there are 1,000 reasons why this is impossible. Stop. His voice was firm but gentle. Don't you dare call yourself just anything. You're the strongest person I've ever met. You're funny and kind and stubborn as hell. You make me want to be the man I was before I learned to protect myself by hurting everyone else. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling. Really? Instead of answering with words, Jonathan leaned forward and kissed her forehead, then her cheek, then finally her lips, soft and careful and full of promise. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. I'm going to take care of you, he whispered. Both of you. If you'll let me. Jonathan, I don't want your charity. This isn't charity. His voice was fierce with certainty. This is me asking if you think you could love a man who spent 15 years forgetting how to be human until you reminded him. Amara's answer was another kiss, deeper this time, full of hope and healing and the kind of love that transforms everything it touches. Outside the hospital window, Manhattan sparkled in the afternoon sun, 8 million people living their lives while inside one quiet room. 2 broken hearts learned how to beat in sync. Do you believe people can truly change when they find the right person to love? Share your thoughts on second chances in the comments. When they finally pulled apart, Amara smiled through her tears. So what happens now? Jonathan smiled back, a real smile that transformed his entire face. Now we go home and figure out how to be a family. Home. Wherever you are, he said simply. That's home. 3 weeks had passed since that terrifying night in the kitchen, and Amara had never felt more confused in her life. Jonathan Pierce, the man she'd once feared, the billionaire who had a reputation for destroying anyone who crossed him, had transformed into someone she barely recognized. He'd moved her into the main house's guest wing for observation, hired a full-time nurse, and somehow managed to be present for every doctor's appointment despite his demanding schedule. But it was the small things that undid her, the way he'd learned to make her favorite tea, how he'd installed a reading nook by the window overlooking the sound, the gentle way he spoke to her belly when he thought she was asleep. For 3 weeks, Amara had allowed herself to believe in something she'd never dared dream of, that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't meant to face motherhood alone. That illusion shattered on a cold November morning when she overheard a phone conversation that changed everything. Amara had been returning from her morning walk, doctor's orders to keep active, when she heard Jonathan's voice carrying from his study. The door was slightly ajar, and something in his tone made her pause. Victoria, I told you, the situation is under control. His voice carried that familiar coldness she hadn't heard in weeks. Yes, the maid is still here. No, it's not what you think. Victoria. Amara's blood ran cold. She'd heard that name whispered by the other staff. Jonathan's ex-fiancée, the woman who'd left him at the altar and apparently still had some hold over him. The pregnancy scare was useful, actually, Jonathan continued, his tone becoming more clinical. It's given me leverage with the board. Shows I'm capable of responsibility, of caring for someone other than myself. The optics are perfect. Successful businessman takes care of vulnerable employee. My approval ratings with the female demographic have never been higher. Amara's hands flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Pregnancy scare. Useful. Of course I'm not actually involved with her, Victoria. She's the help. This whole thing is just good public relations. My lawyers have already drawn up a generous severance package. Once the baby is born and the media attention dies down, she'll be relocated somewhere discreet. Maybe Portland or Seattle. Somewhere far enough away that this doesn't become complicated. The words hit Amara like physical blows. Every tender moment, every gentle touch, every time he'd held her when she cried, it had all been calculated. She was nothing more than a public relations opportunity, a way for him to rehabilitate his image. The child. Jonathan's laugh was cold, empty. What about it? I'll set up a trust fund, enough to ensure they're comfortable but not enough to make demands. Clean, simple, final. Amara backed away from the door, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he'd hear it. Her legs trembled as she made it to the staircase, gripping the banister to keep from falling. 3 weeks of believing she might actually matter to someone. 3 weeks of thinking that maybe her child could have a father figure, a stable home, a chance at the kind of life she'd never had. 3 weeks of falling in love with a man who saw her as nothing more than a useful prop in his corporate theater. She made it to her room before the tears came, huge, silent sobs that shook her entire body. How could she have been so stupid? How could she have mistaken calculated kindness for genuine care? 20 minutes later, she heard his footsteps in the hallway, followed by a gentle knock on her door. Amara. I brought you some lunch. You missed breakfast, and Dr. Martinez said you need to keep your strength up. The same concerned tone. The same careful attention. All of it fake. I'm not hungry, she called out, proud that her voice didn't shake. Are you feeling all right? You sound upset. The audacity of his concern made her stomach turn. She opened the door, and Jonathan's face immediately creased with worry when he saw her tear-stained cheeks. What's wrong? Is it the baby? Should I call Dr. Martinez? Stop, Amara said quietly. Just stop pretending. Something shifted in Jonathan's expression. A wariness crept into his eyes. Pretending what? I heard you on the phone with Victoria. The words came out steadier than she felt. I know this is all just some twisted public relations campaign for you. Jonathan's face went very still. For a moment, she saw a flicker of something. Guilt? Regret? Cross his features. Then the mask slammed back into place, and she was looking at the cold, calculating billionaire she'd first met. You were eavesdropping, he said flatly. I was walking past your study. You weren't exactly whispering. Amara stepped back, putting distance between them. Pregnancy scare. Useful leverage. Good optics. Jonathan said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. You bastard, Amara whispered, the word torn from somewhere deep in her chest. You made me believe. I thought you actually cared about us. I do care. Don't you dare lie to me. The fury that erupted from her was white-hot, righteous. You sat with me in that hospital room and held my hand while the doctor said our baby was okay. Our baby. Jonathan. You called her our baby. You made me believe that maybe, for the first time in my life, I wasn't alone. Amara, it's more complicated than... No, it's not complicated. It's simple. You saw an opportunity and you took it. The poor pregnant maid makes good PR for the heartless billionaire. How much is your image worth, Jonathan? How much did my trust cost you? Jonathan's jaw worked silently. She could see him calculating, trying to find the right words to manage this situation. Even now, she was just a problem to be solved. I want you gone, she said with quiet finality. Pack your things and leave. I don't care if this is your house. I don't care if you own everything I'm wearing. I want you out of my sight. This is my home, Amara. You can't. Then I'll leave. She moved toward her dresser and started pulling out the few belongings she'd accumulated. I should have known better. Girls like me don't get fairy tale endings. We just get used by men like you. Where will you go? You're 6 months pregnant, you have no money. I survived on the streets before I met you, Jonathan. I'll survive them again. She stuffed clothes into the same battered suitcase she'd arrived with 8 months ago. At least when I was homeless, I knew where I stood. Nobody pretended to care about me. Jonathan stepped forward, his hand outstretched. Amara, please. Let me explain. Don't touch me. The venom in her voice made him freeze. Don't ever touch me again. She pushed past him toward the door, her suitcase in one hand, her other hand protectively cradling her belly. You're making a mistake, Jonathan called after her. You need help. The baby needs. Amara turned back, her eyes blazing with hurt and fury. The baby needs a mother who won't sell her soul for security. She needs to know that some things can't be bought, including love. This isn't about love. No, Amara said softly, the fight draining out of her as quickly as it had come. It never was. That was my mistake. She walked toward the grand staircase, each step feeling like it might be her last. Behind her, she heard Jonathan follow, his expensive shoes echoing in the marble hallway. Amara, wait. Be reasonable. You can't just leave. We had an arrangement. She stopped at the top of the stairs and looked back at him one final time. The man she'd fallen in love with, gentle, caring, protective, had never existed. In his place stood the same cold stranger she'd always known he was. We never had an arrangement, Jonathan. I was your employee, and you were my boss. Everything else was just a lie you told so well that even I believed it. As she descended the staircase, her hand trailing along the banister she'd once thought was beautiful, Amara felt something inside her chest crack and go cold. She'd survived abandonment before. She'd survived betrayal before. She'd survive this too. What she didn't know was how to survive the loss of hope itself. Behind her, Jonathan stood frozen at the top of the stairs, watching the only woman who'd ever made him feel human walk out of his life, carrying his heart with her, and he was too proud, too afraid, and too late to stop her. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the empty mansion like a gunshot, and Jonathan Pierce realized that all the money in the world couldn't buy back the one thing that had actually mattered. The rain hammered against the windows of Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan as Jonathan sat alone in the sterile waiting room, his $3,000 suit wrinkled and stained with blood from hours earlier. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps, and every tick of the clock on the wall felt like a countdown to losing everything that had suddenly become precious to him. It had been 18 hours since the emergency surgery. 18 hours since the doctors had told him that Amara's placental abruption could have killed both her and the baby if he hadn't found her when he did. 18 hours since he'd held her hand in the ambulance and whispered promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Mr. Pierce. Jonathan looked up to see his lawyer, Harrison Webb, approaching with a manila envelope that might as well have been a death sentence. Harrison had been his father's lawyer, then his, a shark who'd helped him destroy business rivals and protect his fortune from anyone who might threaten it. "The papers you requested," Harrison said, his voice carefully neutral. "Though I have to advise you again that this is unprecedented." Jonathan stared at the envelope containing documents that would change everything. Adoption papers for Amara's baby, a marriage license application, and a complete restructuring of his will that would leave everything to them if something happened to him. "Unprecedented doesn't mean impossible," Jonathan said, his voice hoarse from hours of silent prayer to a God he wasn't sure existed. Harrison sat down beside him, lowering his voice. "Jonathan, you've known this woman for 8 months. She's your employee. The media will have a field day. Your board of directors will question your judgment. Your competitors will see vulnerability and attack." Every word Harrison spoke was true. Jonathan had built his empire on the principle of never showing weakness, never making decisions based on emotion, never letting anyone close enough to have power over him. This went against everything that had made him successful. "She doesn't even know how you feel," Harrison continued. "What if she rejects you? What if she thinks you're just playing the role of savior? You could lose everything and gain nothing." Jonathan closed his eyes, remembering Amara's hand in his during the ambulance ride, how she'd whispered, "Thank you," before the sedation took hold, how she'd looked at him like he was someone worth trusting instead of someone to fear. "I've already lost everything that mattered," Jonathan said quietly. "I just didn't realize it until I thought I might lose her." Harrison sighed, recognizing the futility of arguing with a man who'd made up his mind. "The adoption will take months to finalize, and that's assuming she agrees. The marriage. Jonathan, she's vulnerable right now. Recovery from surgery, a newborn baby, financial insecurity. Some people might say you're taking advantage of her situation." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Jonathan had spent his entire adult life ensuring he never took advantage of anyone in a way that could come back to haunt him. Not out of morality, but out of self-preservation. The irony that the first purely selfless thing he wanted to do could be seen as manipulation wasn't lost on him. "Then what do you suggest?" Jonathan asked, though he already knew what his lawyer would say. "Give her money. Set up a trust fund for the baby. Get her a nice apartment in a good neighborhood. Make sure she never has to worry about finances again, but keep your distance. Protect yourself and your company." It was a smart play. The safe play. The kind of calculated decision that had made Jonathan Pierce a billionaire. It was also everything Amara would expect from him. Down the hall, a baby cried. Jonathan's head snapped up. Every infant sound in the maternity ward had been making his heart race for hours, wondering if it was Amara's child, wondering if he'd missed something crucial. "She's awake." Dr. Martinez appeared in the waiting room doorway, her scrub still bearing evidence of the long surgery. "Both mother and baby are stable. It's a girl, by the way. 6 pounds, 2 ounces. Small but strong." Jonathan shot to his feet. "Can I see them? Are you family?" Dr. Martinez asked, then caught herself. She'd seen him in the emergency room, seen him covered in blood, seen him pace the halls like a man facing the end of the world. She's been asking for you. The walk down the hospital corridor felt longer than any boardroom negotiation Jonathan had ever endured. With each step, he had to choose. The safe path that had protected him for 15 years, or the terrifying vulnerability of loving someone more than he loved his own security. He paused outside room 314, seeing Amara through the small window. She was propped up in bed, pale but alert, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in pink hospital blankets. Even exhausted and recovering from surgery, she was beautiful. Not the polished, calculated beauty of the socialites who'd tried to capture his attention over the years, but something real and unguarded. She looked up and saw him through the glass. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the entire world narrowed to that single connection. She smiled, not the careful, deferential smile she'd worn as his employee, but something warm and genuine. That smile made his choice. Jonathan entered the room, his heart hammering against his ribs. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck," Amara said softly. Then her expression grew serious. "Jonathan, I need to say something." He moved closer, prepared for her to thank him politely and dismiss him from her life. Prepared to be told that she was grateful but wanted to handle things on her own. Prepared to have his heart broken in the kindest possible way. "I heard what you said in the ambulance," she whispered. "When you thought I was unconscious." Jonathan's blood turned to ice. In his panic during the ride to the hospital, he'd whispered things he'd never said to another human being. Words about love and need and how losing her would destroy him. Words that made him completely vulnerable. "Amara, I love you too," she said simply, and Jonathan's world tilted on its axis. The baby stirred in her arms, making tiny mewing sounds. Without thinking, Jonathan reached out and touched the infant's impossibly small hand. Tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb with surprising strength. "She needs a father," Amara said, watching his face. "And I need someone who sees me as more than just help. But Jonathan, I won't be your charity case. I won't be the poor girl you save out of guilt." "You're not," Jonathan said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're the woman who made me remember what it feels like to be human. You're the person who turned my house into a home just by being in it. You're—" He pulled out the manila envelope, his hands shaking slightly. "You're the woman I want to marry if you'll have me. And the baby. I want to be her father. Legally, officially, completely." Amara stared at the adoption papers, then at the man who'd spent months treating her like she was invisible, who'd somehow become the person who'd saved her life and captured her heart. "The board will hate this," she said with a small smile. "Let them. The media will have a field day." "I don't care. People will say you're having a midlife crisis." "Good. It's about time." Amara looked down at her daughter, then back at Jonathan. "She's going to need college tuition in 18 years. Harvard's expensive, but I think we can manage. And a wedding. Daughters need big, beautiful weddings. Whatever she wants. And a father who'll read bedtime stories and check for monsters under the bed." Jonathan leaned down and kissed Amara's forehead gently. "Every night for the rest of my life." The baby opened her eyes, dark and alert, taking in this strange new world. Jonathan felt something crack open in his chest, a warmth spreading through places that had been frozen for 15 years. "What's her name?" he asked. "I was thinking—" "Hope," Amara said. "Hope Pierce, if you're serious about this." "Hope Pierce," Jonathan repeated, testing the sound. "His daughter. Their daughter. I like it." Outside the hospital window, Manhattan glittered in the afternoon sun, full of possibilities and new beginnings. Jonathan Pierce, the man who'd spent his life avoiding emotional risks, had just made the biggest bet of his career. Not on a merger or acquisition, but on love. And for the first time in 15 years, he felt like he'd already won. 1 year later, the same East Hampton estate that had once felt like a cold fortress now buzzed with the warmth of family. The October sun streamed through the kitchen windows where it all began, illuminating a scene that would have been impossible to imagine just 12 months ago. Amara Pierce, the name still felt like a miracle on her tongue, stood at the granite countertop, but this time she wasn't washing dishes. She was decorating a birthday cake for their daughter, Lily Rose Pierce, who was taking her first wobbly steps across the marble floor into her father's waiting arms. "Come to Daddy, beautiful girl," Jonathan cooed, his voice softer than silk as he knelt on the kitchen floor in his $1,000 suit, completely unbothered by the finger paint stains on his Armani jacket. The man who had once terrified Wall Street executives now made silly faces at a 1-year-old and considered it the most important work of his life. "She's going to be walking everywhere by next week," Amara laughed, watching her husband catch their daughter and spin her around. The sound of his laughter, deep, genuine, frequent, still amazed her. The angry, cruel man who had found her bleeding in this very kitchen had been replaced by someone she'd fallen in love with slowly, then all at once. Lily babbled happily in her father's arms, her dark curls bouncing as she clapped her tiny hands. She had Jonathan's intense eyes but Amara's smile, and she'd already wrapped the most powerful man in New York around her little finger. "Mrs. Pierce, the guests are starting to arrive," announced Maria, the head housekeeper who had become like family. The entire staff had been shocked when Jonathan had not only kept Amara on during her pregnancy but had also given everyone raises and started treating them like human beings. Love, they discovered, was contagious. Through the kitchen windows, Amara could see cars pulling up the circular driveway. Not the usual collection of business associates and social climbers, but real friends and chosen family. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had delivered Lily and had become Amara's closest friend, was unpacking presents from her car. David Martinez, Jonathan's business partner who had helped him restructure his entire company culture, was setting up a bouncy house on the lawn with his own children. Most importantly, Amara saw the Detroit license plate on an older sedan and felt her heart swell. Her foster sister Carmen, along with 3 other young women from her old group home, had driven 12 hours to be here. Jonathan had flown them in first class, put them up in the guest house, and treated them like the family Amara had never thought she'd have. "I still can't believe this is my life," Amara whispered, leaning into Jonathan as he wrapped his free arm around her waist. "Believe it, my love. You saved me in every way a person can be saved." His voice carried the weight of transformation. The Pierce Foundation, established 6 months after Lily's birth, had already opened 5 homes for pregnant women in crisis, with plans for 20 more across the country. Jonathan had discovered that his true calling wasn't making money. It was using that money to ensure no woman ever faced what Amara had faced alone. The kitchen door swung open, and Carmen burst in with her characteristic energy. "Girl, this place is still ridiculous. And you," she pointed at Jonathan, "you better keep treating my sister right or Detroit will have words with you." Jonathan grinned, completely unfazed. "Yes, ma'am. Though I think she's the one in charge around here." "Damn right she is," Carmen laughed, scooping Lily from her father's arms. "And this little princess is going to rule the world, aren't you, baby girl?" As friends and family filled the space that had once echoed with loneliness, Amara found herself standing in the exact spot where she'd collapsed a year ago. The memory should have been traumatic, but instead it felt like a miracle. Every drop of blood, every moment of terror, every tear had led to this. Penny, for your thoughts? Jonathan appeared beside her, his hand finding hers automatically. Just remembering, she said softly. A year ago, I thought my world was ending right here. I never imagined it was actually beginning. He lifted their joined hands and kissed her wedding ring, a simple band she'd chosen over the massive diamond he'd wanted to buy. You know what I was thinking about? That first night in the hospital when you finally let me hold you while you slept. I realized I'd spent 15 years building walls, and you tore them all down in one night. We saved each other, Amara corrected, watching Lily squeal with delight as Carmen spun her around. The afternoon sun shifted, casting the kitchen in golden light. Through the windows, they could see the Long Island Sound sparkling in the distance. The same view that had once felt like a prison now looked like paradise. Mama. Dada. Lily's first clear words rang out across the kitchen, and both parents rushed toward their daughter, hearts full to bursting. Did you hear that? Amara gasped. She said, Mama and Dada, Jonathan finished, tears in his eyes. Our brilliant little girl. As they knelt together on the marble floor where their love story had begun in crisis and blood, surrounded by chosen family and genuine laughter, Amara realized that sometimes the most beautiful love stories started in the darkest moments. Sometimes you had to fall apart completely before you could build something stronger. What do you think about second chances and love transforming even the hardest hearts? Share your own stories of unexpected love in the comments. The party flowed around them, friends celebrating, Lily taking more adventurous steps, Carmen regaling everyone with embarrassing stories about Amara's teenage years. But in the center of it all, Jonathan and Amara Pierce stood together in their kitchen, hands intertwined, hearts full, looking toward a future that promised more love than either had ever dared to dream possible. The blood that had stained this floor a year ago had washed away, but the love that had been born from that crisis would last forever. Some stories begin with endings, and theirs had begun with what felt like the end of everything, only to discover it was actually the beginning of everything that mattered. As the sun set over the Hamptons estate, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, the Pierce family stood together. No longer a rude billionaire and a scared maid, but a husband, wife, and daughter who had learned that love really could conquer all, especially when you had the courage to let it. Thanks for sticking with this story till the very end. But trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. The next story is crazier, more shocking, and will blow your mind. Click the image on your screen now and dive right in. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a single twist.